So we have lots of great questions today, some questions from people who registered in advance, giving us questions early on. And I'm sure we'll have a bunch more. I have tons of questions, so I'm going to get started here. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Kathleen Woods with San Mateo County Libraries. And as I said, I am zooming in from the Pacifica Sharp Park Library. I'm excited to be here tonight to welcome Rachel Khong, author of Real Americans. Woohoo! Look at that beautiful cover. Yay! Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that our upcoming cooking demonstration with James Park, author of the cookbook Chili Crisp, 50+ recipes to satisfy your spicy, crunchy, garlicky cravings. And that was a tongue twister that I had to practice before saying that. James will join San Mateo County Libraries over Zoom on July 23rd at 6:30 p.m. You can register at smcl.org/authortalks and be sure to keep your eyes open for free giveaway copies of Chili Crisp, the cookbook, as well. As for tonight's logistics, your microphone and video will be turned off, but please feel free to use the chat and submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A. For those who'd like to access live closed captions for this event, click on CC and then show subtitle. And now San Mateo County Libraries is thrilled to introduce Rachel Khong. Rachel Khong is the author of Goodbye Vitamin, winner of the California Book Award for First Fiction, and named a Best Book of the Year by NPR, O, the Oprah Magazine, Vogue, and Esquire. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, The Cut, The Guardian, The Paris Review, and Tin House. In 2018, she founded The Ruby, a work and event space for women and non-binary writers and artists in San Francisco's Mission District. She was born in Malaysia and lives in California. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here, and I love the library, so this
Yay.
is very meaningful.
Hooray. Yes, well, the library is very happy to have you. So we're going to get started right with some questions here tonight. I wanted to start with sort of the first page of the book, the first thing you let us see and start to introduce us to some of your themes of this novel, Real Americans. We have the epigraph, like you, I was raised in the institution of dreaming, from Cameron Awkward Rich. So that is from a poem called Meditations in an Emergency, which I might read for everyone here. And then I'd love to hear from you why it was important for you what this poem has to do with the book for you, or how it felt important or spurred some of the questions for the book.
Yeah.
Okay. I wake up and it breaks my heart. I draw the blinds and the thrill of rain breaks my heart. I go outside. I ride the train, walk among the buildings, men in Monday suits. The flight of doves, the city of tents beneath the underpass, the huddled mass, old women hawking roses, and children, all of them, break my heart. There's a dream I have in which I love the world. I run from end to end like fingers through her hair. There are no borders, only wind. Like you, I was born. Like you, I was raised in the institution of dreaming. Hand on my heart, hand on my stupid heart. I love that poem so much.
Yeah, me too. I feel like
I
I
got
get
like full
goosebumps.
body chills.
I know, me too. Every time I hear it, I'm like, oh my God, it's such a good poem. I came across that poem a few years into writing this book, actually, and it just spoke to so many of the things that I was writing about and thinking about. And I love that phrase, the institution of dreaming, because that seemed to apply so accurately to this country, to America, and each of the characters in this book, I think, was raised in this institution. And how do you institutionalize dreaming, right? It's such a weird concept, and yet somehow we have, right? It has become this really dominant narrative here, like, the American dream and all of the stories that sort of fall under that. And so I really, just sort of wanted to include that poem as a sort of as something you sort of came into the book with, like, that question of what does this mean? What is the institution of dreaming? And I think the entire poem is something that I hope that people will, it's on the internet, you can find it online, you can read it again, but it's so beautiful. And I love that line, I wake up and it breaks my heart. And it's something that I'm thinking of now. There's always just these like global catastrophes, right? Terrible things happening in the world. And I think this is very much a book about yeah, I don't know, the question of why do I get to live in comfort while, across the world, people are starving in Gaza or there's the fighting in Ukraine. You know what I mean? Like there's so much that's going on. Why do I get to be here? Why is my life the way that it is here? And yeah, and I love that poem. So I'm glad you started with that and you brought that up.
Yeah, I know early on in the book, there's also the moment when, there are emergencies that sort of unfold in the periphery of the, well, periphery for some characters, not periphery for other characters. But like Lily is alive during 9/11, lived in New York,
Yeah.
says very specifically, I had all these questions about what I was trying to make of a purpose of my life. And here
Hmm.
I am still alive when
Hmm.
all of these other people have lost their lives. The questions of building, connected to having a dream, living one's purpose, all of these characters are also sort of troubled by or driven by the desire to make a meaningful life. What does it even mean to make a meaningful life? I wonder how much did those questions about what it is to do meaningful work, to live with meaning, inform the writing of this book, both in how you sort of shaped your characters and maybe just even through your own process of drafting and writing and revising and publishing?
Yeah. Yeah, that's such an interesting question because it's like I can't really wrap my mind around writing in about anything else, right? Like for me, writing is so intertwined with trying to make meaning, right? Or trying to understand why we're all here.
Mhm,
It's a
mhm,
question that I think is most urgent, maybe when you're at a certain age, when you're coming of age, right? When you're trying to figure out who you are. And I've been thinking about this book sort of it is, sort of bunch of different types of stories, but it is, I think, fundamentally three coming of age stories. We hear from three characters about these moments in their lives when they're really um, trying to understand who they are and they're trying to form themselves and they're trying to understand why are we even here?
mhm,
There's this I don't know, like some people it's religion that tells you, why we're here and gives you some meaning, but I think for these characters um they don't know. There's this like randomness, right? To like, okay, so why am I here of all people? Why am I alive? Why do I get to be alive? Why do I get to be privileged? Why do I get to do all of these things? What is
mhm,
it all for? And I think that it's just a question that like animates like this this act for me, right? Like writing itself is how I'm sort of getting a little bit closer to um I don't know what I think my own life is for, right?
mhm,
And so it kind of made sense. I think that each of these characters was also sort of, I put them in this in these phases of life in which they're trying to understand like, okay, yeah, what does my life look like? What am I going to do? Um, with it. I mean, and that actually
mhm,
makes it sound too utilitarian because I think in some cases, in some of these characters' lives, it's not about like a usefulness, it's not about a certain productivity. I think that's very much this idea that's been placed upon us, especially in this country, that we should make something of our lives, like be ambitious, um, you know, be something great, essentially. And I think that's not really what I'm interested in. It's more like, yeah, how will we form meaning? And I think it's different for every person.
right. Yeah, the characters are also confronted by that like American desire to save the world and
Yeah,
where that comes from too, and if that's useful, or how much do we demand for a tree to have purpose when what kind of
exactly.
question is that really, right? Why can't a tree just be a
Yeah,
tree, right? Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that you bring up a tree because I've been thinking about trees a lot in terms of just the like books themselves. I think it's
Mhm.
so interesting that books, once they become like an actual book, right? Like, and you can hold them and you have to sort of, I have to like go around trying to sell this book, I guess, at this point. Um, it becomes a product and it's like this thing that exists in capitalism that you buy. But I think of a book as a work of art, right? And it's sort
Mhm.
of this organic expression too. It's like something that I made from my physical human body. And to me, it's more like a tree, right? Like
Mhm.
you can like a tree or not like a tree. Like you can maybe judge a tree, I guess, if you want, but it would be kind of silly, right?
Yeah.
It's just a
Yeah.
tree and it's kind of doing what it's doing, and it's maybe a shape that you resonate with or you don't. But I think of all of these books in the library, right, as all of these different trees. And so the business of like selling them, the business of comparing them is so strange to me because it's, yeah, you wouldn't like give one tree an award and not another. Actually, you probably can at this point. There's probably some kind of competition that's like the most beautiful tree competition.
Yeah,
But like
right.
it makes sense, yeah, that maybe like, that feels more like a dog show kind of thing, right? Like we have bred this dog into perfection or whatever. Whereas I
Mhm.
think, a book to me is more just this like beautiful organic expression that shapes, like takes whatever form that it takes.
And sort of similar to another character at some point is talking, considering the rings of a tree. And almost, I love
Mm,
this image so much that the rings of a tree, how much, if that person were cut open, would you also see like 7 versions of themselves at different
mm,
stages of their life? And similarly, a book, right? It goes into the world from your hands, and then the way any reader is going to receive it or any person's going to receive it is going to be so unique. Like that
yes,
book changes in every situation
exactly.
it's in,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's also why I love like the physical book, because I get to, oh yeah, you can see my wild notes. Because I get to like talk to the book as well and have it and change my own relationship with it
Yeah.
through that. Oh man, okay, this is leading me to so many different questions. Like I feel like everything, all of the themes of this book connect so richly that I'm gonna struggle to stay like without starting all around. But we're starting to talk a little bit about the Americanness and sort of the individualism of a goal of like creating purpose, and some of a question that we just received in the chat, and a question that we received upon registration as well was about the title of your book, Real
Hmm.
Americans. What it could take on several meanings, and patrons are curious about your thought process for this title, Real Americans.
Yeah. Well, so I started writing this book in December of 2016, which was right after the election. And I didn't have the title for many years, actually. I probably was working on the book for 3 or 4 years before I came across the title. But I think that phrase was in the air. It was used by our new president,
Mhm.
um, and and it's such a like provocative phrase, right? Like you hear that, and there's like some um I don't know, like I feel weird.
It feels like it excludes. Like it just
Yeah.
feels like it is drawing a very sharp line
Exactly,
in a way.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think so I was working on this book, and at one point when I was writing that first section, part one, in which Lily is narrating, she visits China, and someone tells her
Mhm.
there, "Oh, you're a real American," because it's this Chinese man who's telling Lily, who is, this Chinese American woman, that she seems to him a real American.
Mhm.
And I've sort of had that similar experience, like visiting Asia, right? Like feeling as though, okay, so now I resemble a lot of the people around me, but I don't fit in here because I don't speak the language. I don't have the cultural references. I'm missing a lot of this context, and people can just pick you out right away. They're just like, okay, this is an American. Like I'm so aware that you're an American. And so when he said that to Lily in the story, I thought, oh, I think that might be the title.
Mhm.
Because it made me uncomfortable, that phrase.
Mhm.
But it also applied so much to each of the characters in the book and what they were sort of going through. I think the phrase um, means different things to each character, and they all interact with that concept in different ways. I think the word real is something that comes up a lot in this book, right? This sort of question of authenticity. What does it mean to be a real something?
Mhm.
Um, and then with American, I mean, yeah, I think it's something that um, I question the existence of a real American, right? It's like I think that if someone can tell you confidently what a real American is, um, I don't trust that person. Like that's not something that I believe in, actually. I think that American can be a very expansive term, or it can be a really, exclusionary one, right? Like you mentioned, the exclusion, like sort of inherent to that phrase. But I think the sort of idea of America is that it's supposed to be, right, like expansive and like give me you're tired and you're poor and all of that, right? But at the same time, it does have this history of exclusion. And I think that it's, America is a place that's very much built on the stories that it tells itself about itself, right?
The
And
institution of dreaming, right? Yeah, right.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the dream itself. And I think that even the story of America, it sort of was founded in, like a lot of murder, right? And like kicking people out, right? Like, you think of real American, you think of that phrase, and you might think of somebody fresh off the Mayflower or something, right? But at the same time, that is a story that America tells itself about itself, right? It's like, here's where we started,
Mhm.
and conveniently forgetting, you know, everything that happened before that particular moment. So I think I just wanted, yeah, I mean, the title did sort of scare me. I was like, oh, it's maybe a little bit too provocative. But at the same time, I think I was interested in that provocation. I was interested in, yeah, how are you coming to this book,
Mhm.
right? Like, what do you think of this phrase? Like, what does it mean to you? Does it make you feel, what does it make you feel about your own sense of belonging? And actually, is belonging even possible, honestly, right? Because I think I've talked to a lot of people now on this tour who, um, yeah, just like I think the belonging is very elusive in this place in particular, because yeah, I think there are a lot of ways in which you are, I don't know, what it means to be American is very, yeah, it can be either narrow or, again, like more expansive.
We have a character like Nick, right, who is like totally white passing, is always talked to as though people
Mhm.
will say racist things around him
Yeah,
because
right.
he like belongs in their group, he thinks that people think. And he's constantly insisting, I'm half Chinese. I'm like he's never saying I'm American. That's never something he's asserting. That's the thing that is
Mhm.
always assumed about him. And May and her husband are like almost intentionally try to be
Right.
be American when they leave a really traumatic situation in China. And then yeah, and then Lily has that wrestling of how she is seen differently where she is. It just
Yeah.
the title like opens up questions about all of those characters' experiences with that
Yeah.
question. Yeah, I think.
Yeah. And I think that, you mentioned each of these characters and sort of what their struggles are. I think for each of them, there's a way in which um, they are sort of they're trying to sort of assert themselves against what people immediately assume about them, right? Like I think this is a book that's very much about appearances, right?
Mhm.
Because I think America is very much about appearances and about wanting to categorize people and like fit people into huge,
Mhm.
just like categories of people. And that's never actually accurate, right? Like the reality of each individual person is, oh, this person has done so many things that you don't even know about, like you would
Mhm.
never have imagined. They have lived a very specific life that you might never have imagined. There's just a way in which like um yeah, like category can really like blunt the
Mhm.
reality of like who we are, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, early on my editor brought up that I use the word look a lot in this book. There's a
Mhm.
lot of looking, and there's a lot of just like sort of like making judgments about people based on looking, but then also questioning that, right? Like questioning the accuracy of looking itself. And so yeah, your sort of summary of that made me think of the ways in which they're all, you would look at each of these characters and think something about them, maybe, right? You would make assumptions about them, and their realities are actually completely different.
And then in some ways, how characters, when we are in their interiority, might not always know how people are perceiving them. Like their sense of
Yeah.
self is different, right? Like I'm thinking about for Nick, when his friend says, you're good looking, right? That's gonna like get you like
Mhm.
indoors and stuff. And he's kind of like, what are you talking about? There's a, we are mysteries even to ourselves in those moments of not
Yeah.
always understanding how we're perceived from the outside and trying to make sense of that relationship between self
Yeah.
and sort of like being an object of someone else's gaze at the same
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I think he, like Nick as a character, kind of has the luxury of not thinking about it as much, right? Like how
Mhm.
he's perceived, and it's the characters who sort of feel, I mean, he does feel like an outsider as well, but I think, you know, for his mother, especially for Lily, she's so hyper aware of how she's.
Oops. Rose a tiny bit from me. It's okay. Okay.
Am I
Okay.
back?
Okay, you're back. You're here. You're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, so I
Mhm.
think there's I really wanted to write about these three different characters who have these very different perspectives and embody very different realities and different bodies, right? And show how their experiences might be different.
Yeah. What was that experience like for you in that writing of moving into
Mm.
these three voices? Did you have to do any like ways of like entering these different perspectives, or like how you knew, when the structure of the book might emerge? I don't know. It would be very like they
Yeah.
do really feel like they have distinct voices.
Mhm.
And I think especially Nick is this much younger when he's narrating too.
Yeah.
Like he feels younger. What was that writing process like for you?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for this where I was like, I had a certain hat that I wore for this character and another hat for this character. I didn't have anything like that. It was interesting because each of the characters actually came to me quite um, formed, at least in terms of their voices. Like I
Yeah.
heard their voices very clearly, and the very first pages of each of the three sections that are narrated by these characters, they're pretty much exactly as I wrote them.
Yeah.
Like when I first came up with these characters. So I think I had their voices really clear. I had their sort of time periods really clear. Like I knew when they were, yeah, when they were around, like what they were sort of dealing with. But it did take a long time to just get to know them and to understand what their stories were, and also how all the stories intersected. I'm not a person who writes from an outline.
Right.
I'm really jealous of writers who are, but I mean, I say I'm jealous because it would be, I think, a faster process. But at the same time, I think what I really love about writing is the surprise of it and the fact that I can have no idea what I'm even writing and have some, like, a passage surprise me or have a character surprise me, right? And have them surprise me with what they do or what they're actually interested in. I mean, I think a real feeling character is a character who isn't fully comprehensible, right? Like
Mhm.
even like you were saying, like a mystery even to yourself, right? Like the characters sometimes have these contradictory sort of emotions. I mean, I think it's an emotion itself, right, is always sort of so layered, and you can be feeling sad one moment and then like deliriously happy the next. Like it's just so intricate, I think, human consciousness. And so I think the characters came together sort of from a lot of um, I mean, truly just a lot of spending time with them, like writing out
Mhm.
a lot of scenes and sort of putting them into situations and then seeing what they did with those situations.
Yeah.
And then after that, sort of looking at it and piecing things together. I think I do a lot in revision, actually.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it was just such a pleasure to inhabit these different bodies and these different perspectives. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, the fact that um, we all just get to live our one lives, really. And there are limits to those lives, right? We can only be in one place at one time. And one day we're gonna die, and like we're mortal and we're limited. But I feel like reading and writing are ways in which we sort of get to transcend that, and we get to try on existing as another
Mhm.
human being, and we get to try on these different lives, and that's like endlessly fascinating to me, and that's what makes reading and writing so yeah, just endlessly interesting.
And try on all these different choices and mistakes and
Exactly.
like those surface things that people see, like the actions and reactions,
Yeah.
and to delve under them. Like I love how much later on in the book, and I will try not to talk too much about like later on in the book too, but our scientist characters are frustrated. Is frustrated that sort of frustrated by other people's need for certainty and not just loving the
Yeah.
mystery of the natural world and like how science is probing those questions. But it's so
Mm-hmm.
much looking, like you said, like we're again like looking at a person. Science is this act of looking at
Yeah.
or at a lotus and like seeing what's beneath it physically. Or you have an artist character say that the artist's job is to observe, or what is it like observe
Mm-hmm.
something like
Yeah.
observe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I wondered about how you were thinking about the connection or how you thought of a connection between science and art or the process of discovery. So there's a later
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
book, there's a quote that echoes what you were just saying. Yeah, where was it? It was something about, I thought I had it on the right page, but of course, no, it was something about um, finding, okay, great, here it is. Science requires patience, and I've always been an impatient person. What I lived for was that private moment, discovering something no one else had. The moment before it is shared with others, when it is a secret only yours. In that moment, it doesn't feel like an accomplishment, but a gift from some God. So that
Mm,
moment of mystery, of discovery. Yeah. Nice.
yeah. Yeah. I love that you bring that up. I was very much thinking about um, science and art
Mhm.
and the sort of, I don't know, the things that they share. We were just talking about sort of the limits of what you can know about a person based on what they look like. And you mentioned science as observing, right? And sort of like, yeah, I think assessing, right, the world and sort of looking and trying to understand and kind of believing that you can understand everything, right? Like if you do put in the work and you observe things empirically, um, and I think there's this real, like, sort of idea or maybe stereotype of both scientists and writers. I mean, I'll just speak to that specific kind of art, but like both scientists and writers that, you know, that they're really knowledgeable and they, um, and that they
But
know
they
what
know
they're,
something.
and that they
Yeah.
know something. But I honestly, yeah, I feel like it's the opposite, right? Like I write not because I know something, but because I have questions.
Mhm.
And, um, and it's not from a place of certainty, right? It's not from this place of wanting to like impart some kind of knowledge. And I think it's similar in science, right? There's this idea that like, we all have this sort of image in our minds of the really confident scientist who like understands everything and is so brilliant and whatever. But I think that science also operates from this place of not knowing, right? Like I think that's where the really interesting stuff happens, where if you can acknowledge that you don't know, right, and you have all these questions, that's where the sort of um, that gift from the God can kind of come, right? And things can sort of surprise you. And so um, I think I wanted to write about that, right? Like just how there is this tension between, I think, I think especially in our culture, we love the idea of the person who knows something, like
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
expert,
Yeah.
the sort of like really confident individual, the person who understands things. And I think we have sort of we have lost sight in many ways of the sort of value of humility, right? And understanding that you don't know everything, and there are things that we could still learn and observe. Like I think that's something that I'm really interested in, and I wanted to write about, especially in this book, just like that tension. And why is it that we love certainty so much? I mean, it makes sense, right? Like it's like very sort of reassuring to believe that we know something
Yeah. Yeah.
or to sort of follow the person that you believe knows something. But I think um, there's also another approach that just is more about openness, right? And more about curiosity and more about entering a relationship, um,
Mhm.
yeah, with an open mind and willing to be surprised and open to the mystery.
I think some of the relationships where that is so apparent, at least like in my life and then in this book as well, are these relationships we have with our parents who
Mhm,
are a
mhm,
very knowable, in some ways, entity to us for a long time in our
mhm,
lives, or they feel like they're that steady, they know something, they will teach me how to do
mhm.
something. And then as we grow up, either like what we don't know about them or things that we realize we disagree with them outcome become more and more clear, right? So throughout this book, of course, we have, these three generations. We have some very obvious mysteries about the different parents and some that are more slow to kind of unfold. I wonder what was interesting to you or what made you drawn to this idea of going through these different timelines and how sort of the mysteries of a person's individual life and choices, what they might purposefully hide from others, and also how just like cultural displacement, like being left, being sort of forced to leave your home country as May is, what those questions, how those influence knowability and how much we can know our parents and communicate across different times and expectations. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
barely a question, but you get.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. No, it's such a beautiful observation because I think that is so much of the project of this book. It's about how much we can know about the people that we love and also how much we can know about ourselves, right? It's really so much about who, like how we become who we are, all the different factors that go into that. There's obviously genetics, there's culture, there's the choices that we make in our own lives, also the parents that we had, right? There's so many things that sort of influence who we are. And and yet it's just not clear to me. Like, I don't know why I'm a writer. You know what I mean? I have some guesses as to why I became a writer or why I am the way that I am, but I don't know for certain.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's interesting, um, yeah, trying to understand your loved ones, right? Like you mentioned, parents, being people that we should be able to understand, at least in theory, because if you grow up with your parents, you spend a lot of time with them.
Mhm.
There's this familiarity, but at the same time, that's not the same as real knowing, right? It's
Mhm.
the sort of,
Mhm.
I think intimacy can exist without real knowing too. I don't know. It's I really wanted to write about that. The fact that like you can love someone so deeply, you can be physically close to them, you can even share their DNA, right? And you
Mhm.
can still really not fully understand them, because you are just totally different people and you're coming from these different contexts, right? And
Yeah.
even though some of your lives overlap, right? Like some parts of your lifetime overlap, it's just not the same. Like you're missing, you're missing moments. You're just not like even twins, right? Like
Mhm.
I don't think even
Totally.
if you had
Yeah.
you're just different people, right? And I think that's so fascinating to me. It's like a little bit heartbreaking,
Mhm.
that you can't have that sort of like mind meld that you wish you could have. But at the same time, I think it's really beautiful to try to make the effort of like making that connection and trying to understand a little bit better where each party is coming from. And again, like acknowledging the limits of what you can understand about this other person. I think, you know, this, uh, I think it's really easy to judge people,
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
judge family members especially,
Yeah.
and to judge other people's choices. But I think this book is very much about um, like questioning our rush to judgment because we just don't know. Like it's impossible to have the full context of another person. Like if you don't understand somebody's decision that they've made, it's probably because you don't understand their whole life, right?
Right.
Like there's something that you're missing about where they're coming from, like what their life is like. Um, and so it was really important to me to have not just one character's perspective, right? But to have um, three different characters from the same family over the course of these different decades essentially, and to have some of their stories um, overlap but also like contradict
Yeah.
others, right?
Mhm.
And to have some of the stories deepen the other stories, where you might make a judgment of May's character, for
Mhm.
example, earlier on in the book.
Mhm.
Once you get to hear from her, like about her actual life and hear about what it's actually like to be her, the hope is that some of that judgment, fades away a little bit because you can see where she's coming from, or at least, to more of a degree. But I think that was the sort of interesting question to me, and the project of this book was like, how can I yeah, use this form that is so much, as we said, like about being able to beam yourself into these different
Yeah.
consciousnesses, right? And to actually have those consciousnesses like sort of juxtaposed and in conversation with each other and deepening and complicating what previous characters have believed or, experienced.
Something I really loved about this book is that through that, as things are unfolding, we're learning more about the characters. I feel like you never explain away the ways that they've still harmed each other. You know what I mean? Like those things remain true, but also that these characters like insist, and I really feel it in the writing. Like I feel it is true that there's such genuine love between characters here. And like you write, especially like you write moments of love and connection so beautifully between so many of these characters. Even as characters wrestle with what is is love hiding something from someone to protect them? Is love being known?
Hmm.
How does a person express love differently? Like, is Nick wonders if his mom, if that's a surely that can't be an American intensity of love. Lily wonders why her mom could never like or say. It never felt like she was saying "I love you." It always seemed like a double foreign language. When did you know that this book would be so infused with love? Was that
Oh,
immediate? Yeah.
yeah, that's so interesting. I think it, I don't think I knew, I don't, again, I didn't know anything going into it. I sort of
Right.
have to write my way into these things. Um, but I love that you bring up love because I think it's one of those things that, um, obviously it's universal, right? And it's something that all of us know about. And yet I do wonder what it's like for each
Mhm.
person, right?
Mhm.
Because we have no idea. It's like the thing of like experiencing colors, right? Like we have
Right.
no idea what it's actually like. We have no idea um, what it actually means to specific people. And we sort of operate in the world as though we do because
Mhm.
we kind of have to. I mean, that's what language is in general, I guess, right? It's like agreeing on these meanings of words and then using them like we're using, that in a way that presumes that we're communicating perfectly.
Right.
But there's always
Exactly.
so much, yeah, there's so much misunderstanding. And within this family specifically, um, love has different meanings because of their sort of cultural differences, right? And May was raised with a very different style of love
Mhm.
with than the one she raises Lily with, and then it kind of keeps going, right? Lily
Mhm.
then tries to sort of raise her son in a different way or a way that she believes would be best.
Mhm.
Um, but is it the right way? It's
No.
kind of unclear because I think, again, each of these characters is coming up against the limits of what they can actually know about their loved one. And they're all just trying their best, honestly. Like they
Mhm.
are really doing a lot of what they do out of love, but they, yeah, they just don't fully understand their loved one. And that's why there's sort of, yeah, all of this miscommunication and also yeah, I think missing of each other.
Yeah. We remain so individual that one person's like genuine expression of love isn't necessarily even just the
Yeah,
physical language of how another person receives
right,
that,
right.
right? So
Well, there's like
it's
the
so
classic love
drawn to
language thing,
yeah,
right? Like,
yeah, of
yeah,
course. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, we're getting a bunch of questions from our patrons too, so I want to make sure we answer. There's so many things we can talk about, but I want to make sure we bring in some of those as well. Okay. Do. Okay.
Are we
Thank
talking
you.
about spoilers, by the way, or
Well,
no?
I would say like it's kind of up to you. There's some stuff I feel like in part three maybe that we
Okay.
keep away. I don't know. You know, I probably there might not be people who've finished the book here.
Yeah,
So
sure.
it's up to you overall. This is a very character-based book, but there are mysteries that unfold.
Yes.
And I'm so fascinated by how you sort of foreshadow and how you let those mysteries unfold. But I'm gonna let some patron questions come in before I before I ask all of mine. Um, can you talk a little bit just generally about your research process for the
Oh,
book?
sure. Yeah, it's I don't have a very organized way of doing research
That's a
necessarily.
relief.
Yeah. But there was so much research involved for this book. I mean, I think for most of my writing projects, that's part of the fun of it, is that I sort of get to learn about something that I don't already know about, which is most things, honestly. So with this book, I knew early on that a couple of the characters were geneticists, and this was about genetics because it's so much a book about becoming ourselves, right, and who we are. And I remember being interested in biology as a high school student, but I wasn't necessarily good at it. So I never pursued science. I just sort of took the bare minimum of
Yeah.
classes and focus really heavily on writing
Mhm.
and my other pursuits. And I think as an adult, you get to do whatever you want to, right? And
Mhm.
study what
Mhm.
you want to. And
Mhm.
so, especially as a writer, that's a really I don't know, it's a privilege to get to sort of read widely and read about what you are interested in, even if you didn't necessarily like excel at it in
Mhm.
school.
Right.
And so with this book, I did a lot of reading of both books and articles. There was the research into the science aspects, and there was also research into the Cultural Revolution, because I didn't have any family members who had personally gone through it. So it was more about reading books, also watching, oral histories,
Mhm.
and gathering stuff from all different places, and also letting what I learned inform the um the plot itself, like inform the book itself. It wasn't as though, I was writing the book and I was like, okay, now I need some details about the Cultural
Right.
Revolution. I'm
Right.
going to um write them in here. It was more that I really read very widely and read about lots of different things. And at any moment, I was sort of like holding each of these ideas very loosely,
Mhm.
um and they came into more focus as I did my research, as I did my reading. For a while I didn't even know, my family's from Malaysia and we're Malaysian Chinese, but um most of my family is in Malaysia now, or they've immigrated here. And for a while I didn't know if this book was about Malaysia or if it was about
Yeah.
China,
Yeah.
and I
Interesting.
was
Yeah.
doing reading about everything. I was like trying
Yeah.
to read about what their lives would have been like in these different places. And then sort of as time went on, I realized, oh, it is about China, and it's
Mhm.
about being Chinese in China um, because this is very much a book about these like national narratives,
Yeah.
right? And we come to these countries, we come to America, we come to China with preconceived ideas about what they are and what they represent, right? And it was just going to be different with Malaysia, right? Like you have to kind of educate people about Malaysia. It's just a different sort of beast.
It also
Um,
makes sense to me how, like, as you got to know these characters more and more, you would get to know more and more how all this research you were like
yes,
using yourself in would also
exactly.
shape them. Like, if that's sort of in the cloud of what you're thinking, but not like I mean more like a mist, not like a
Yes, yeah.
floating cloud.
The
Like if
fog.
that's yeah, if that's in the
Yeah,
fog of just like what you're thinking about, and then you're
yeah.
also like trying to learn these characters, like it makes sense that that would start to link up for these different characters too.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not like, I wasn't writing um, a purely historical thing or a purely
Mhm.
scientific thing. I was trying to just be educated enough and learn enough that would apply to the characters'
Yeah.
lives also. It wasn't I wasn't a perfect student of all of these different things. But it was really exciting to just like sort of get to do this research and to learn much more than I would otherwise just sort of come across like in sort of like regular news reading or whatever.
Yeah.
But I will say another important thing to the scientific research aspect was that I got to like, well, okay, what should I talk about? I mean, I guess, well, when I was first thinking about this book, I actually was thinking a lot about America's history of eugenics,
Mhm. Mhm.
and the fact that, in the early 1900s, it was basically just accepted that it was a good idea to try to like breed better American babies. And the research was funded by a lot of these powerful families,
Right.
including the Carnegies, there there was this I guess research laboratory or research center on Long Island at Cold Spring
Mhm.
Harbor. And so I was thinking about that place when I
Yeah.
wrote Maze Lab, and I was thinking about the sort of shady history there. Even though eugenics in the end didn't quite make it into the book, it's not really, it's still like part of the
Yeah.
DNA and the thinking of it. Um, but late into the book writing process, I saw that Cold Spring Harbor, which is a working laboratory now, and they do a lot of genetics research and really interesting medical research. They were hosting an artist residency.
Whoa.
Um,
Wow.
and so I applied to that and I got it. And I went, like, this is my
Wow.
final sort of revision
Yeah.
process. I went there and I got to um, visit laboratories and talk to scientists and just sort of like take in the atmosphere of this place that I had imagined up until that point. And that was really special. But
Wow.
it's funny, like, you know, the things that I imagined, it almost fit you know what I mean? Like I had
Yeah.
imagined them, but they also fit already. It's not like I had to change that much. I think the imagination does get you very far. Today I was at the Seattle airport,
Mhm.
and there's a scene in the book where Nick and his mom, Nick is being dropped off at the airport by
Mhm.
his mom, and I could almost like picture them there. Like I was
Yeah.
there, like, pulling
Yeah.
up to the curb, and I was like, oh yeah, in some other like universe, Nick
Yeah.
and his mom are here too.
And
It's so
in some ways
funny.
they like were, right? Because you're their
Yeah.
creator and you brought them there. You sort of beamed
Yeah.
them into space. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so fascinating. I feel like also this book, I felt so immersed in the world, very much like through character sensory experiences, though. Like you describe settings, you describe the world, but there's so much through each character's way, as you said, you like inhabit their bodies, you move through
Mhm.
space as them. So there's never this, I feel like we're so much more within the characters, and then the settings are sort of almost like floating around them. So it makes sense that it would fit. Like, I don't know, it doesn't
Right.
really making that much sense, but you don't take time to super like world building is not the project of the book. It's like
Yeah.
the character's experience of their worlds and their world's impact on
Yeah.
them. So yeah,
But I
that's
think it's also, each of these characters is so much shaped by where
yeah,
they live, right?
yeah,
Or like the
yeah.
places that they inhabit. And I mean, like on this really grand scale, it's like, okay, what does being raised in America,
Hmm.
how does that form a person? Like, what does that mean? Like when you're a person who's raised here, what does that mean? What does that mean about who you are?
And in objects as small as, like, I was so fascinated by the recurring the motif of like oysters, the
Mm-hmm.
flowers as home decor, and the different ways those
Mm-hmm.
show up in different spaces, like these little details of a person's physical space and what they associate with those tangible objects um,
Mm-hmm.
were really informative as well. Okay, that'll be my last question. What was fascinating to you about like the image of the oyster?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny. The oysters, I was thinking about, I think I'm always going to write about food in fiction because
Uh-huh.
I do care a lot about food and eating it, but I also think it's such an interesting thing in that we all have to do it every day. It's almost like to draw a weird connection, like we were talking about love, right? Like everybody knows about love, everybody knows about food, but like it means different things to different
Mhm.
people, right? And some people couldn't care less about food, and some people care a lot about food. And also food can be so complicated. It can be this marker of status. But it's also just like at its most fundamental, something that you need, right? Like when people are starving, it's just so deeply unfair, right? And it's just this huge tragedy. And so I wanted to write about, I thought like, okay, what's a food that embodies all of that, right? Like, or you can sort of see in these different contexts. And so oysters came to mind because Nick is being raised in the Pacific Northwest, and oysters are this food that have become this sort of, statusy type food. They're a food that you can get at a really fancy restaurant. And yet, fundamentally, they're like almost like a peasant food, right? Like you would get them just sort of like more plentifully like in the past, right? Like the during the gold rush, like all the miners were eating oysters and they were so cheap, right? And people were getting sick of them. And so in the book there are those, you know, really rarefied moments where people are eating oysters, but there's also on the other end of it, the people who are raising the oysters, farming the oysters, right? And
Hitting them
having,
with a baseball bat, which is such a
yeah,
great, like,
yeah,
it's a great image contrasted with like the very fancy images of,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, like that
Homer's campaign.
brutality, like
Yeah.
being out there in the cold, in the water, and like having to like smack oysters with a baseball bat
Mhm.
compared to like the experience on the other end of it, where someone is getting to sit at a restaurant and to pretend that that moment never happened, right? Or just like imagine that this just appeared out of nowhere. I think
Yeah.
that was just, yeah, something that um, it is something that I find so fascinating, right? The ways in which we, um, yeah, I don't know, we like to complicate our lives a little bit, right? And like
Yeah.
make things mean something about, I don't know, like, you know, status is like so it's I think it's so present in culture today, right? And especially in this country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And storytelling about that, the accessories of storytelling, sort of, right?
Yeah.
So another, okay, we have lots of questions from patrons. Let's see. One I'll wait till the end. So similar to sort of invisible work, let's go from that
Mhm.
to a patron says invisibility is weaved throughout the story. Can you elaborate on the concept of invisibility?
Yeah. I'm actually really curious about this question. Like what I don't know, what do you think? Like what are the invisible?
What's invisible, what's latent? Maybe question asker, if you want to expand
Yeah.
a little more, that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
And
I'm
then
thinking,
so other questions I'm gonna like rephrase. We'll wait for to see if we get a little more on that. I'm gonna try to rephrase this question in a non-spoilery way, sort of. Uh, like time is such an interesting
oh yeah.
fixation throughout this book. I was really interested in it as like also a creative person who
Yeah.
really like has a bad relationship with time, like doesn't really understand how it passes or
Yeah.
why. What and there's people have this fraught relationship with wanting more time or feeling that as though they're experiencing a time glitch early on,
Mhm.
you know, more of a almost a negative experience. What fascinated you about the question of time? Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for rephrasing it. Yeah. I think time is something that I was thinking about a lot when I was writing because um I mean, Katie, you and I met at the Ruby. I started this workspace in San Francisco called the Ruby, and it was a more than full-time job. And I was like working on this book when I could, and I would often like hide away in the morning just like for an hour. And I would just try to squeeze the writing
yeah.
into, you know, the smallest possible portion of my day. And that is how I've always written, right? Just like on weekends, on holidays, whenever I could. And I have always felt pressed for time.
Mhm.
And I think it's in part, you know, I think many of us feel pressed for time, right? You might have a really demanding job. You might have children who demand a lot of you, right? Like there are all these ways in which it's really difficult to be a human being, you know, living in capitalism and needing to make a living, but also wanting, you know, this creative fulfillment and wanting again, like to
Mhm.
go back to the very beginning, like your life to mean something,
Mhm.
right?
To
And
make
wanting
use of your time, right? Time is,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, wanting meaning. And I think I wanted to write about time because, again, this book is so much about these American narratives and American myths and what does it mean to be an American. And time is something that I think is so much a part of the American consciousness. Like this, like you were starting to say, like we talk about time as though it's money, right? Like
Mhm.
we spend
Mhm.
time, we waste time, we save
Mhm.
time. You know, we
Mhm.
talk about it in this language of capitalism, and it makes sense because we are so pressed for time within the system of capitalism, and yet, um, I think I don't know, it's really sad, right?
Mhm.
Like to sort of view our lives as something that is, you know, just to view our lives as like a means to some kind of productive end, right?
Right.
Or to have to always be using our time so wisely, or to feel bad when we're not using our time. You know, I think that
Yeah.
the time that we spend with other people in relationships, like the time that is the most, to me, well spent, right? Like either writing or being with people, those those uses of time, yeah, what do they amount to, right? Like
Right.
it's hard to sort of quantify the value of that. And yet I think there does need to be this, at least for me, I think in writing this book, um, I felt this adjustment a little bit in how I was like sort of thinking
Yeah.
of time and my own attention, right? And I wanted to sort of pull myself away from the conditioning that I had been steeped in, which is the conditioning that tells me, oh my God, you have to always use your time. Like you're too busy to see your mom or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
yeah,
As though interactions with our moms don't inform the writing that we're
yes.
doing, right? Like or they don't need to inform the writing also. They
No,
don't need to
no,
see the
yeah,
book, I'm also still doing it.
exactly. Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
as though it's not all part of the same project of living, or not
exactly.
project of living, even the language of
I
this
know, even the
is
language,
getting all tangled up.
it's
Yeah.
hard to get around it because I think we're so like product oriented, I guess. And even it's funny again, like talking about this book, it is now a finished book, but
Hmm.
for so many years it was not the finished book, right? And
Hmm.
it was that messy thing in the middle, and it was um and I've been thinking a lot about this recently, how writing, it is a lot like just like sitting around on a couch with your family, in
Hmm.
that it's not immediately productive. Like maybe you wind up with a book at the end of it. I don't know, maybe, and it's fine
Yeah.
if you don't actually, because I think it's more about this conversation that you have with yourself, this devotion and this attention that you give to the questions that you're really interested in. And I think that has so much value. And it's I think it's of a piece with, yeah, spending that time with your loved ones, right? It's not
Mhm.
productive. It's not a means to an end. It is just, I think, a valuable part of life. It doesn't even have to feel necessarily that good, right? But the fact
Yeah.
that you are putting your attention there,
Yeah.
with your loved ones, with the piece of work that you're engaged in, I think that is really meaningful, right? Because it's in these spaces that we are actually attending to what we love and who we love. And it's really apart from this whole system of,
Right.
like, I don't know,
It's
being marketed to and being sold things and all of that.
it's more that practice again of like curiosity and not knowing and receiving too, like
Yes,
from engaging in a different way than is just like production sort of also assumes this knowing because you're trying to make
mhm,
this thing that
yeah,
others need or others need to receive, and those other relational moments with the work or with the like with the world through writing or with others is there's so much more of a give and take there, a
exactly.
relation, like more of a relationship. Okay, we're almost out of time, so we do have a follow-up question. Does
Okay.
Lily feel invisible at times, would you say?
Um, does she feel invisible? I think she definitely feels that belonging is elusive to her. I don't think that she necessarily finds belonging in places easy. I think she might feel the opposite of invisible, honestly. Like
Mhm.
she feels very visible. She feels like people are always wondering. I don't, she feels
Yeah.
like she doesn't quite fit in, or that she should look a different way. Yeah, so I think it might be that um she feels too visible. And also, this is related to what we were talking about earlier. She feels that she's an American. That's all she's known, right? She's been raised in this country. Um her family was really, like, by design, they assimilated hard, right?
Mhm.
And they sort
Mhm.
of didn't give her Chinese culture, and so she feels, for better and worse, like all American. And yet she feels in these spaces where, she is an American, she feels like visibly other, right? And sort of,
Mhm.
um, yeah, and she's hyper aware of what other people are thinking of her. And I think each of the characters in this book, they appear one way, and then again, like they are their realities are so different, right? And I think um it's again just this I wanted to explore that. I mean, both in Lily's character and Nick's, and I guess also May's, right? Because like she's this very unassuming, by the end of the book, she's this
Yeah.
very unassuming sort of elderly woman. And like seeing her on the street, you wouldn't have no idea.
Yeah.
Um what she had been through. Yeah. But invisibility, actually, as I'm saying that about, May specifically, like she is a person who, at the end of the book is pretty much invisible, right?
Mhm.
Like I think that is something that comes up, the fact that she, is very much ignored by society because society it almost like gravitates toward like the young and the full of potential and the people who can quote unquote change the world. And as this much older woman, um, again, it's like, whoa, what's the value? What's the
Right.
value of a much older woman? Like, what can they offer? And I think that was very much intentional to take this invisible, seeming woman and to just, yeah, like
Yeah.
really explore her life and what it was like to be her.
And when she's invisible, she knows so much more about herself versus like Lily, who is so hyper aware of how she's being perceived that it's almost like interrupting her access to her own to knowledge about herself. Like
Yeah.
she thinks much more about, it seems at least she thinks a lot more about where she's fitting in or where she's not than she really sits with what she wants, what she knows about herself, right? For a while.
Mhm.
Wow,
Mhm.
this time, speaking of time flying, this time like flew by. I'm sorry to anyone that we didn't get to your question. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. And thank you so much, Rachel, for the really fun talk and for like bouncing
Yeah.
around through different ideas.
Thank you everyone for being
Yeah,
here. This is really
it's
special.
it's a great, thanks for sharing like a lovely summer evening with us as well. As Sam is saying, you can register for our upcoming author talks at smcl.org/author talks. And please let us know what you thought of this event at smcl.org/rate this event. I'll also send out those links in a follow-up email. And other than that, yeah, have a great night. And have a great night, Rachel. Rachel's off a whirlwind book tour and hopefully gets to rest a little bit tonight and celebrate as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for the time you spent writing this book too. I really, really loved reading it. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you. Bye,
Bye,
everyone. Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Bye.